Good morning. Welcome to today's program, Meeting the North American Energy Infrastructure Challenge, and greetings to those of you watching via the webcast or the film version in the future. I'm David Biet. I'm director of the Canada Institute here at the Woodrow Wilson Centre. The Canada Institute works to increase knowledge and awareness about Canada and U.S.-Canadian relations among U.S. policymakers and opinion leaders. We focus our work in three primary areas: borders and border security, trade, and energy environment. First, though, I'd like to thank our partners in this event: the Canadian government, the Canadian Energy Pipeline Association, Enbridge, and TransCanada. I'd also like to recognize a member of the Canada Institute's Advisory Board, who will be here a little later, David Manning, who's recently been appointed Alberta's representative to the United States. I'd also like to recognize 5 state legislators who are with us today: Alaska Senator Bert Stedman, and I was supposed to pronounce his name wrong. Oklahoma Senator Cliff Brannon, Kansas Senator Carolyn McGinn, North Dakota Representative Bob Scarpel, and Alaska Representative Doug Isaacson, who was also going to be here. And I'd also like to recognize Herb Cox, an MLA from Saskatchewan. And if there are any other electeds here who you didn't identify yourself, tell me later and I'll make sure you get recognized. A little bit of background for those of you who are new to the Wilson Center. The Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars was founded in 1968 by an act of Congress as the official memorial to our 28th president, Woodrow Wilson, our only president with a PhD. At the center, we build a bridge between the worlds of academia and public policy by fostering independent research, open dialogue, and actionable ideas as we tackle the nation's problems and challenges. Energy, as we know, is an important part of the Canada-U.S. relationship. The United States gets more energy from Canada than from any other country. Last week, the Canada Institute looked at hydropower partnerships, in particular Manitoba's and Quebec's partnerships with U.S. utilities. That information in the webcast is up on the web, and we were happy to have Premier Selinger with us and Ambassador Dewar. With the development of new sources of energy in the United States and Canada, we found that we don't always have the infrastructure to get that energy, in whatever form it may be, to where it's needed. This is true for new sources of renewable energy as well as for traditional hydrocarbon-based fuels. So today we'll look at one sector. We'll look at Canada-U.S. cooperation in other sectors later. So a little bit of housekeeping. Today's program, as I said, is being filmed, so please wait for microphone when you ask a question and identify yourself and your affiliation. Emergency exits are well marked outside. I'd also like to point out that the Canada Institute next week will welcome Canada's leader of the official opposition, Thomas Mulcair. The leader of the New Democratic Party will speak on building a balanced, sustainable economy in North America and around the world, and you can sign up for that on the website, and I believe it will be in this room next Wednesday. So first, let me introduce our moderator, Jim Hecker, Senior Counsel Energy Strategist with Hush Blackwell. Over to you, Jim.
Thank you, David. Thank you all for being here today. I always enjoy being at the Wilson Center. It's one of the few places in town that seems to be having constructive discussions. It'd be nice if we could take a vote on some of this afterwards, but we'll have to leave that to the folks up the street. The discussion today is going to focus, or this panel anyway, on oil pipeline infrastructure, and we have 2 excellent panelists. I'm delighted to be able to introduce them. The full and exhaustive bios are in your materials, and I would direct you to them. Brenda Kenny is President and CEO of the Canadian Energy Pipeline Association. She is an advocate for a wide range of industry issues involving safety, environmental responsibility, economic and regulatory efficiency, financial competitiveness, and so forth. She is a doctor in resources and environment, mechanical engineer, and I think her presentation is going to be quite illuminating. Our other panelist is Andy Black, president of the Association of Oil Pipelines. Andy has a long series of experiences in town, including having run external affairs at my old agency, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. He has been running AOPL since 2009, and in that role has been a leader for a progressive build-out of oil pipelines and transportation of petroleum products. He is an alum of Texas Christian and the University of Maryland, and I will be delighted to turn it over to them. But first, I have to seize the moment for a little about electric power. The late Warren Rudman, Senator Rudman, and his colleague Felix Royatin, who was a financier who rescued New York City back in the 80s, used to opine frequently about the dreary state of domestic infrastructure, everything from roads and bridges to wastewater treatment facilities and highways. But they said that the infrastructure crisis was no less serious for it being silent. And we are delighted to do a little bit today to help break that silence. There's a lot of talk about infrastructure, investing in infrastructure, but it's sort of like the weather. A lot of people talk about it, but nobody does anything about it. So maybe we can encourage some progress and activity in that area through these kinds of discussions. The American Society of Civil Engineers, and I need you to watch for this announcement this month, has been doing a series of studies of aspects of domestic infrastructure and port facilities, water treatment facilities, roads and highways, and electric transmission, which is something I work quite a bit on myself. Their overall rating for America's infrastructure is a D, and they will explain in greater detail than I can in a few minutes exactly why that is the case. But generally speaking, we have to invest much more heavily in these basic platforms for our economy than we have heretofore. And just to give you an idea, economists that have studied this issue have looked at the high voltage electric transmission grid in the United States and concluded that between now and 2030, we are going to have to invest about $300 billion with a B dollars to ensure reliability, to reach new renewable resources, and to harden the system, to upgrade it from an electromechanical to a digital system, and so forth. This sounds like a big number until you consider the fact that we'll have to spend about $1.5 trillion just to maintain and upgrade the electric system as a whole. Between now and mid-century, we're going to effectively be replacing the entire electric system. And it's an exciting but a daunting prospect. And we need to find the political will and the regulatory processes that will help us attract capital to those kinds of infrastructure platforms. Our electric system right now it's aging. Most of it was built in the 1950s and 60s. It is, as I mentioned, not yet entirely in the digital age. It doesn't reach some of our best renewable resources. And we are experiencing a lot of reliability issues, occasioned not just by Superstorm Sandy and such events as that, but just the stress on the system by the fact, due to the fact that we have a competitive wholesale bulk power market that didn't exist when these facilities were built. So we have a lot of work to do. We have a regulatory system that's not a very good one for the task. And if you want to read more about this, I would direct you to the website of my client, the Wires Group, which is at www.wiresgroup.com, and you can read more about it there. I'm delighted now to refocus this discussion on pipelines and another great energy delivery infrastructure. Energy delivery infrastructures don't have any natural constituencies. People are always looking at what goes in one end and comes out the other, and so pipelines and transmission lines and those things that we regard as relatively invisible are largely ignored, and that's one reason we tend to underinvest in that area. So I'm going to turn it over to Brenda Kenny for her remarks, and then follow with Andrew, and we look forward to your questions.
Great. Well, thank you. Thank you very much. And it's a pleasure to be here today. Certainly a topic near and dear to my heart, and I look forward to the discussion and questions to follow. I think that Andy is going to provide us with a little more of the context around some of the market issues, as well as perspectives that he holds with respect to the U.S. situation. I wanted to focus many of my remarks on the context from a Canadian lens, and then dive in a bit to some of the issues that are not strictly technical or strictly market-based, and make sure that they were out on the table as well. So to begin that, some of you may have seen this cartoon which has been floating around. Being Canadian, I felt I should start here. I may seem familiar but somehow strange. And one of the things that in all kidding aside, I would point to about the Canadian context for infrastructure is two historical things that I think are important for context. The first is that in Canada, our pipeline infrastructure began to be built in the late 40s. We had some connections for regional interconnects, of course, but there was a significant political debate in the mid-1950s with respect to two big questions in our House of Commons. One question was, should pipeline infrastructure be on Canadian territory or oriented toward North America? And the second big question is, should it be paid for by government as critical Canadian infrastructure, or should it be funded by private enterprise and deployment of capital? The decision made on natural gas was it should be on Canadian territory, and hence we have the Trans-Canada Mainline north of Lake Superior. On oil, there was already a good, strong linkage between Canada and the United States thanks to the Chicago refinery hub and other things, and I think our histories have roadmapped largely to that. On capital, the decision was deployment of private capital works really well. It's a smart way to get public interest delivered in an economic and efficient manner. So what we have today, of course, is very significant companies with large reach, and that overall together they are responsible for moving about 1/4 of the mercantile trade value of our country. So a significant undertaking from a basic GDP level, and certainly we are the safest way to achieve that objective. These member companies of CEPA, some of you would know well, and there are significant investments underway in the tens of billions of dollars. Together they employ about 8,000 individuals, and that number is growing. But our story is not so much about direct employment as it is about the enabling that comes from reliable infrastructure from the upstream and through to the markets where that is needed, and the reliability that was mentioned at the beginning. So just for context, this is a map of liquid pipelines that are emanating from Canada. They have a far reach and connection, of course, into the United States. And together, of course, we share a lot of the value and reliability. We are the largest provider of energy to the United States outside of your own country. On natural gas, it's a very similar roadmap. That's not a surprise because, of course, the geology under the ground is where natural gas and oil come from, and the cities, markets, refinery hubs, and the like are where the energy goes to. So the footprint is similar. And we need new connections. It's partly the reinvestment. Certainly, that's ongoing. Probably. Well over $1 billion a year in reinvestment. And in addition, market diversification is critical. Within Canada ourselves, the eastern part of our country is largely reliant at this point in time on imported crude oil. So you will hear more and more conversations about diversification across our country. That's an important part of it. Diversification globally is another important part of it, and continued strong positive connections to the United States that could push other supplies coming in from Venezuela and Arab countries, et cetera, is another part of it. I now just want to talk a little bit about the current context. So you can see from those maps, and any of you involved with energy would understand that there are a large number of interconnections that exist today, and many more to have a well-functioning market will be required. But I know, having grown up as a kid in Montreal, that there were many times we were parked in our car at a level road crossing, and the game was to count how many rail cars are going by in front of us. There's probably lots of kids across the United States who have a similar recollection, and therefore right from the get-go a sense together of what's involved with rail or highways. Any of us living near seaports, or myself in Montreal, the Seaway, have a sense that things move around on boats or barges down the Mississippi. But very few kids, very few adults have ever really thought about or even been aware of these systems, which are running 3 feet or a meter under the ground across hundreds of thousands of kilometers. Out of sight, out of mind is how we recognize where our industry has been, again, emanating from Canada, at least, from a profound belief that pipelines are in fact instruments of public interest, delivered through the use of private capital. There was no need to position this industry as a competitive, member of the public space, because we just were a bunch of engineers keeping things running safely. That has changed. It's fundamental that people have a context now. The stats are clear. We are the safest and most reliable mode of transport, and where pipelines are not permitted, alternatives do emerge, which are very helpful from an interoperable point of view, but perhaps have unintended consequences of their own. Those of you today here who are senators, I want to say thanks for being here, and I can tell you that in Calgary on Tuesday, I spent half the day with a number of Canadian senators who were visiting Western Canada to visit sites related to oil and gas. And I know that some of you have had occasions to be in Canada and do the same. I would welcome you at any point. But provided on the table out back are a few copies of some recent responses we provided to the Senate as undertakings with respect to pipeline safety. And I think it's very important that we provide as many facts as possible. My third bullet on this slide is part of the reason why. Unfortunately, some groups have chosen to provide information which is clearly false, and I can't speak to what their motivations would be, but the outcome is certainly a sense of unwarranted fear, rather than positive debate and dialogue about where we can and will improve on performance. There are some of the myths outlined on this slide, And I want to focus in particular on diluted bitumen and whether or not it is safe to transport in pipelines. Again, on the back table, you'll find yet another report we received just last week from the UK outside of the bubble of controversy of North American pipelines by a world-renowned corrosion group. And yet again, it has demonstrated unequivocally that bitumen is not corrosive in pipelines, and that in fact, if you're going to have a safety question on pipelines, it is not about internal corrosion at all anyway, which includes the myth of abrasiveness. All the sand stays in Fort McMurray, I can assure you of that. Very tight specs, but the facts speak for themselves when you look at the actual number. So I think it's important that if we're going to have productive dialogue and a sincere movement toward energy systems that work for Canadians and Americans, we hold everybody to account, including groups who are trying their best to move forward on issues that are of concern to them. But honesty and accountability are fundamental to this issue. It matters a lot. And of course, we'll continue to see active and vigorous debate. Some folks will choose to do that by way of demonstration. Others will roll up their sleeves and actually try to solve problems. But nonetheless, that is the context in which we are currently facing our pipeline issues. In Canada, there are very few incidents considering the scale of the overall presence, and we report right down to a smudge of oil on a valve stem. So the smallest of incidents are considered when we look at how to move forward. To do that, we have a very specific and systematic approach under something called CEPA Integrity First. The Canadian Energy Pipeline Association is working collaboratively across our industry through a management system approach, much like responsible care in chemicals. This drives performance improvement, shares learning from any incidents, and we hope provides even more information actively in the public sphere. And I would invite any of you to visit the website aboutpipelines.com if you're interested. Technology and innovation is fundamental. We are active participants in PRCI. See Peter Lydiak here from API, and obviously there's a lot to be gained through a collaborative approach on the fundamentals such as inline inspection in the top photo and other things that avoid problems of corrosion. But regulatory leadership and assurance is also fundamental. We believe that public interest is central to our business, as is performance, and ensuring compliance and public trust is a fundamental role for regulators. The quote up top on this slide is from the National Energy Board, who have defined public interest as being inclusive of all Canadians and refers to the balance of economic, environmental, and social interests that change as society's values and preferences evolve over time. So when the NEB does a public interest discovery through a large hearing and review, they are addressing all of those issues. Our industry has advocated firmly and vociferously for strong and effective environmental assessment. We believe it is a fundamental cornerstone of any major pipeline decision, and one project, one review is the best way to make sure that that's clear, that the evidence is well tested, it's thorough, it's transparent, and then if it is approved, the conditions are upheld, projects are audited by the regulator, on-site inspections, compliance, et cetera, and of course ensuring that emergency response is in place and delivered. In our industry, we have always committed to and remain committed to addressing any and all issues, and the recovery rate is extremely high, where on rare occasion there have been spills. Clearly, this is about stakeholder dialogue, about understanding what the evolving expectations are in a truthful and honest way. And we are endeavoring to reach out to, engage, and address our systems around issues that are material, not just to the pipeline engineer who knows thoroughly what he is or she is staying awake at night thinking about and how they're going to drive that very technical solution, but also what is of material interest to folks who may be less technical and may have very valid questions and concerns. Water is a good example of that. There is no evidence in any of our history that pipelines have been injurious to waterways in Canada, but it is a question mark that we certainly uphold as important and address both in design and in emergency response. And we need to make sure that we've got the right connection points so that people can share their views and we can make sure that we're addressing them. Part of that is education. As I said earlier, the context is not well understood in general in the public. Frankly, even in those who with very valid social or environmental interests are raising concerns. Many times those concerns, I would say, are very valid issues, but are very uninformed in terms of the context. And by engaging productively, we can, I hope, have reasonable discussions that actually yield results. I want to be clear, I'm not trying to be naive or, as per my original cartoon slide, strange, but I acknowledge fully that there will continue to be tactics which are deliberately divisive and objectives which are designed with the intention purely of creating a polarizing effect, better yet if born out of fear. I understand that will continue. There are some people who are seized with that as a tactic, as a strategy. I'm telling you that our industry is positioning itself to both defend vociferously against outright lies and, more importantly, take ownership for ongoing performance improvement and productive engagement to any and all who wish to participate in something oriented toward the public interest. So to summarize, we are an industry that has a long track record of safety. We are committed to and have demonstrated continuous improvement. Some of that is technology innovation, some of it is systematic practice, some of it is improved standards. There are a lot of things that go into assuring that we will get to our goal of zero incidents. Canadians can know more about their facts and Americans as well by looking at our aboutpipelines.com. And if there are any issues there not addressed to your satisfaction, please let me know because we're continuing to build that out. We see the energy sector in Canada as a beachhead for many sectors. The spin-off benefits are huge, as they are here in the United States as well. So we need to take it very seriously as a committed avenue for leadership, performance, accountability, transparency, and respect. And all of that, I hope, will result both in responsible performance on our part and responsible, effective public policy and results for all of us. Thank you.
Thank you, Brenda. Annie?
Thank you, Chairman Hecker. Thank you, David. Thanks to the Wilson Center and the Canada Institute for this timely discussion, for giving me the opportunity to speak, and for the formidable challenge of following Brenda Kenny. I'm Andy Black, President and CEO of the Association of Oil Pipelines. AOPL represents the owners and operators of pipelines carrying crude oil, refined petroleum products, natural gas liquids, and carbon dioxide. It's appropriate for the American panelists in an event like this, and probably in the contract, to start by showing proper respect for the U.S.-Canada relationship. I think the U.S. is lucky to have along its long border such an ally, friend, and trading partner, and we're lucky that both countries are blessed with energy resources. I'll go further and I'll say that I think the movie Argo dramatically understated the role of Canadians in saving the American hostages. I will recognize the superiority of Tim Hortons over similar offerings here in the U.S. And to the people like Brenda from Quebec originally, I'll give a heartfelt thank you for the Montreal Expos. A sympathetic thank you as a guy who's lost a football team. So having established that, I feel like now I can maybe take advantage of the fact that many Canadians know American history better than many Americans know American history. And I can start my speech with an American-centric reference, the Statue of Liberty. there in New York Harbor. As many of you know, there's a famous poem at the statue by Emma Lazarus, The Colossus, right? And the key phrase about the importing of human resources is, give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. Imagine, if you will, in a couple of years, a statue of energy liberty up by North Dakota, Montana, Saskatchewan. And if there was a poem there, it might not be as elegant, but it might go, give me your huddled, somewhat stranded masses of lower-priced crude oil yearning to reach American workers and consumers. Today, with additional connections to our tremendous North American energy references, the U.S. and Canada can enjoy energy liberty to a greater extent than in any of our lifetimes. My topics today are the need for additional pipeline capacity for the Canadian crude to reach the U.S., why pipelines are the best option to move those barrels into the U.S., and the need for sound policies and decisions to allow needed pipeline investments to take place. Crude oil production increased by 790,000 barrels per day in the U.S. from 2011 to 2012, as you may have seen from EIA recently. EIA forecasts continued growth like that for the next few years as well. And of course, Canadian forecasts call for large growth on top of what has already happened there. The people that follow this stuff say that we are at the beginning of a North American energy revolution. Several areas of increased production, including in the oil sands of Alberta and the Bakken region of North Dakota, Montana, and Saskatchewan, are not matched by a legacy pipeline network with enough capacity to get that oil to the best markets. This produces capacity shortfalls that deny American consumers and workers good access to lower price supplies. I'd like to offer some numbers from private reports done for AOPL by Ensis Energy of Boston, all for the first half of 2013. Bakken production on the U.S. side is about 790,000 barrels per day. Yet pipeline takeaway capacity is only 580,000. That leaves a shortfall of 210,000 barrels per day that cannot move on pipelines even if every pipeline is full. Why this shortfall? Because the growth of Bakken production has been phenomenal, as it has been unexpected. We have a similar story in Western Canada, including the oil sands, as Brenda mentioned. There's a shortfall between supply on one hand and local consumption and exit capacity on the other, of between 34,000 to 224,000 barrels per day, depending on how full the pipelines are. A third problem, south of the border, is insufficiency of pipeline capacity south of Cushing, Oklahoma, the great pipeline hub and crude oil storage depot. On paper, Cushing has a balance of capacity in and capacity out, but not in the direction that currently makes sense south to the world-class refineries on the Gulf Coast of Texas and Louisiana. Capacity in, 1.1 million barrels per day. But capacity out into the south is just 222 to 452,000, depending on the status of the ongoing Seaway expansion. These are all dramatic shortfalls that again deny lower price supplies from reaching the Gulf Coast refineries and the American consumers they serve. So I'll turn next to why pipelines are the best option. The pipeline share of crude oil transportation in the U.S. has recently been about 80%. In 2010, it was 82.5%. As Brenda mentioned, there are other modes that can transport crude oil, of course, barge, marine, truck, and rail, but pipeline is the most preferred by shippers. Why? Because it's the least expensive, most efficient, and most reliable way to ship crude oil. But today, there isn't enough pipeline capacity, or the pipeline network can't help the shippers reach the best market, so these other modes are enjoying significant growth. If you look at the Williston Basin, which includes the Bakken, 58% of crude from that area is exiting on rail. Unit trains, entire trains carrying nothing but Bakken crude oil, have reached Texas, Louisiana, Pennsylvania, Delaware, Washington State, and more. And now even entire trains carrying crude from Alberta have reached the Gulf Coast. Truck use is growing too, but not quite to that extent. Rail and trucks have first mover advantage. They can often add service to a market more quickly than a pipeline can be built, and they may not need long-term contracts like a pipeline would. Rail and truck has a place in crude oil transportation today, sometimes as a transition mode in some places and as a complement to pipelines in others. But these modes have higher costs for shippers and ultimately the consuming public. One rough rule of thumb is that it costs $2 to $5 a barrel to move a barrel of crude oil on a pipeline. Yet it costs $10 to $15 to move that same barrel on a railroad. And when you look at longer distances, like from the oil sands to the Gulf Coast, that disparity is even greater. And pipelines do not have the externalities that rails have on communities, congestions and road and wear and tear, and are undisputed as the safest method of transportation. Here, the shipper's interest is the same as the public's. A pipeline is the best way to move energy liquids over long distances. I'd like to turn next to the need for sound policies and decisions to allow pipeline investments to take place. Today, as Brenda mentioned, pipeline operators are responding to the need for additional capacity with tens of billions of dollars in publicly announced projects. Operators are proposing new long-haul pipelines, one of which gets an extraordinary amount of attention, constructing smaller segments that serve as key links between crude oil supplies and destination markets, expanding capacity on existing pipelines, reversing the flow of existing pipelines, even converting other types of pipelines into crude oil service. Recently, 760,000 barrels per day of new U.S. oil pipeline capacity has been added into service. More than 2.2 million barrels per day from new projects is under construction right now. Another 2.2 million barrels per day is under firm commitments and appears likely to be built. And then there's another 3.4 million barrels per day in open season or under consideration. As you all probably know, pipeline projects are very capital intensive. Developers raise outside capital for these projects, competing with infinite other investment possibilities for finite investment capital. Decisions to expand pipeline capacity depend on several factors, including 1, shippers willing to sign long-term contracts that pipeline operators can count on. 2, policies from FERC that fully recognize the importance and value of these shipper commitments. 3, long-term rates policies that allow a reasonable return commensurate with the unique risks and competitive circumstances faced by oil pipelines. And 4th, of course, reasonable and timely presidential permit decisions when necessary. The first several of these involve FERC. As former Chairman Hecker knows well, oil pipelines are not usually the top issue there. I'm glad that the current slate of commissioners has shown great interest in infrastructure generally and in the importance of oil pipelines specifically. Long-term contracts underpin project financing and are essential to support nearly every liquids pipeline project, just as they are for gas pipeline projects. When a shipper is willing to sign a long-term contract to support the development of pipeline or an expansion of capacity, the shipper is making a major financial commitment. The Commission has long honored these crucial and mutually beneficial agreements between pipeline operators and shippers. FERC should continue the practice of honoring contract rates for committed shippers. AOPL has supported a petition by Seaway asking for an affirmation of that by FERC. Next, the Commission has long acknowledged the competitive nature of the liquids pipeline business, as Congress has done. Oil pipelines compete vigorously with each other and these other modes that I mentioned earlier. They compete with a different risk-reward profile than electric and natural gas transmission companies, subject to a range of competitive forces and fast-moving market dynamics, as we have seen recently. Pipeline projects are certainly at risk. Indeed, we see examples today of pipelines that recently were doing well but are now suffering commercially because of changed dynamics. The Commission has not applied the same public utility regulatory model from electric and gas transmission onto liquid pipelines for good reason. The statutory framework is different too. For oil pipelines, Congress specifically directed in 1992 a different type of economic regulation, recognizing this competitiveness. As a result, most rates are based on an industry-wide index that incents efficiencies or are negotiated with shippers. Unlike electric and gas, most rates are not measured based on a cost-of-service model. FERC should continue this oil pipeline regulatory model because of the more dynamic nature of the industry, and because it has worked well, and because it is needed to get new pipeline steel in the ground. Regulatory certainty is important for increasing pipeline infrastructure. It's worth noting that while pipelines are essential to transport liquids to market, they don't cost consumers much. It's been estimated that 2.5 to 4.5 cents a gallon of retail gasoline is attributable to the pipeline transportation. As we've seen recently, the price at the pump can change in a few days by more than that due to market forces. Finally, in those rare instances when a pipeline operator wants to cross a border and a presidential permit is needed, that operator deserves a fair review and a timely decision. I'm glad that a draft environmental impact statement for Keystone XL was announced last Friday and that Nebraska has concluded its process. I'm pleased, but not surprised, upon the finding yet again that the project would have only a minimal impact upon the environment because it will have a tremendous positive impact upon American workers and consumers. This process has taken much, much longer than previous permit applications, and hopefully we'll move towards a final decision soon. Framed properly, this decision should be easy. The construction and operation of the pipeline would be preferable to all reasonable alternatives, and certainly in the national interest. Crude oil from the oil sands in the Bakken will move somewhere. It doesn't have to move to the U.S., but it should. It doesn't have to move over pipelines, but it should. Keystone XL would be a great option for Americans by expanding access to lower prices of crude oil, just as other pipeline projects would. The public gets it. Recent polling for Keystone XL by API showed support greater than 69%, and support generally for pipeline projects at greater than 80%. The public knows that access to crude and refined petroleum products helps consumers and workers both. And they know it is better to receive Canadian and U.S. oil through Keystone and other pipelines to displace higher-priced crude oil from other countries that are not always our friends, like Canada. Keystone XL should get a border crossing permit as soon as possible. The Statue of Energy Liberty that I half-jokingly suggested earlier will only be appropriate if we allow and support the development of needed energy infrastructure today. The North American energy map has turned upside down and has created this need. Now, in this energy revolution, is the time for new infrastructure connecting the U.S. and Canada. Now is the time for much of that infrastructure to be pipelines, the best and most preferred way to move these energy liquids. And now is the time for government leadership and foresight so that the private sector can invest the tens of billions of dollars necessary to help both the Canadian and the American peoples. Thank you.
Thank you, Andy. I look forward to your questions. Let me just prime the pump a little bit by asking a question about what's on everybody's mind. That is the Keystone XL Pipeline. Andy, what is your estimate of the timeline for action on this? What are the procedures that are underway right now, and how do you see this resolving itself, hopefully this year?
So last Friday, the State Department announced the intent to publish that environmental impact statement. I believe that comes out this week. I believe there's a 45-day comment period. Then the State Department has its time to produce a final environmental impact statement and then conduct the national interest determination process with other federal agencies. There's a 45-day clock on comments, but then state has a couple of time periods to take its time on that. So I've heard midsummer. Most people recognize that draft environmental impact statement as balanced, as appropriate, as really having studied it. It should be a good document. It's been 4.5 years in the making to this process, but is a good contribution to the honest debate that Brenda said is important about energy infrastructure. So hopefully this summer, but I would have lost money last year. I thought that the project was going to be approved last year. I believe that it'll be approved this year, but I don't know.
Looking at it a little bit from the Canadian side of the border, a lot of what inspired some of the content in the environmental impact statement was the fact that the oil sands, in the State Department's estimation, would have been developed, and that those resources would have gone elsewhere. What were those options, and from a pipeline perspective, were they realistic options?
Well, Canada has many options as far as moving crude oil, and I think that as was concluded, those options will materialize one way or another. We've been long-term trading partners with the United States, and I expect that will continue. Obviously, there are options to the east, the west, and frankly the north that are all being considered. So I wouldn't pick any one project over another, but I think the conclusion in the draft EIS is absolutely correct, that whether or not Keystone is built will have no material impact on the production profile in Canada. It may have an impact in other political reactions that could be detrimental to the U.S. interest, but one would hope that does not occur, and we'll move forward from there.
Okay. One other softball. Obviously, both these presentations demonstrate that we live in a North American energy market, not just a Canadian market and a U.S. market. That's true not only for petroleum products, but it's true for electric power. We are so highly integrated with the Canadian electric system, and even sales of electric power that happen where purchasers and sellers of power are both in the United States. Those little electrons frequently go through parts of Canada on their way to being consumed. But given that unique arrangement between our two countries in terms of infrastructure and markets, is there anything either of you can think of that would be helpful in improving the coordination of regulatory regimes or the ways in which infrastructure are developed?
Well, I could lead off on that. I think that it's been a progression over many decades of increasing interconnects, and that has benefited both of our countries in terms of both market responses and what I would call resiliency, whether that's reliability or being able to recover from a brownout more quickly, being less subject to supply shocks. We sadly can recall what it was like in the early 70s as OPEC rose up and the shock that occurred from that. I think that strong interconnects will reduce that risk. So I point to perhaps daylighting the already active integration on safety, performance, and regulatory excellence that I think has only been increasing over the last couple of decades. But to my slide about below the radar screen, I think probably most Canadians and Americans are not aware of the excellent hard work that's been going on there. Our two regulatory regimes on the safety side have been a little bit different in how they've come at it. PHMSA has tended to be a little more prescriptive, and the National Energy Board has been emphasizing systematic safety, more like sort of the North Sea approach. And I think we're seeing emerge as actually an excellent learning together and a hybrid. So I would just point to things that we've seen on the electricity side, sort of a cross-border exercise on resilience. I think we can look forward to the same on the safety and environmental performance. But I would not want to see us try to bind up a North American approach to regulating that. I think what's more important is to look at how that performance is driven and let each jurisdiction regulate appropriately, but make sure that the metrics, the results are transparent, the public interest engagement about what we're doing, our accountability for that are just increasingly improved upon.
Thank you. Andy, any comments?
I promise this is not a paid advertisement for the Canada Institute, but I think dialogue is an answer. There's recognition in the marketplace that the connections north-south in many cases on energy between our countries are better than actually east-west, even within the countries. Electric, gas, crude oil, the market knows this. You bring a bunch of people in the energy industry together, they recognize the importance of those flows and the interconnectedness of those energy networks. But you want to make sure that government does that. There is a border. These are two different countries. The politics in both countries are complicated. So I'm pleased that we have legislators today from both provinces and states. I think that's important. They can never do enough of making sure government is getting together at the executive level, legislators, recognizing the way this market is. There's two distinct countries, but really a very interconnected energy network. So forums like this, and then when government is talking and nobody else is around, you hope that they're recognizing all of these interconnectedness.
Questions? Yes, sir.
Yes, I'm Carmine DeFilio from the Department of Energy. And with the large discount that...
We have a microphone coming here.
Hi. With the large discount that Alberta oil producers are receiving for dilbit, say, compared to Maine and the Gulf Coast, it's like a $50 difference, maybe larger. And given the fact that in the Bakken from North Dakota, et cetera, the rail activity has been really huge in the United States, moving to refineries on the East Coast, etc. It seems that the rail activity in Canada, while picking up, isn't quite what is happening in the United States, and in particular, the opportunity to ship from Edmonton to Kitimat on an existing rail line. I was just wondering if you agree or not that this is what the reasons for this might be, and what you have to say about rail activity in Canada, realizing, of course, that you're a pipeline association.
Well, I'll overview and then ask Brenda, of course, to talk about the issues within Canada. You talk about price signals, right? These are like the most obvious, biggest price signals out there about the need for infrastructure. These, what I call them, these somewhat stranded, huddled messes of lower-priced crude oil trying to reach, wherever they are. I think pipeline operators recognize, because of those huge differentials, there's a need to move it. The costs by rail and other modes from the oil sands to the Gulf Coast are obviously even bigger than the cost just to move Bakken. I think it's phenomenal that the economics support rail transportation of that length at all, but these differentials do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, indeed. And so you are seeing a lift, and as Andy said earlier, and I would agree that rail is a friend to the market as an interoperable component, as is trucking, and that any sort of sustained long-term larger volume will always be better off delivered by a pipeline. So I think you are seeing increased rail traffic in Canada, and that will remain a valid component. We are in Canada currently working through a very large public exercise on one pipeline option to the West Coast. Another is being actively consulted on the ground prior to filing for a regulatory hearing and ensuing permit. And similarly, as you've probably heard, a lot of very active conversations about a couple of options to go east. Rail to the Port of Churchill is something that's being contemplated as well. There's already an existing rail line there, a relatively small port, but there are options for that avenue too. And I think that the market response will absolutely drive more rail, and that that a long-term stability and recognition that from a safety point of view, from a cost efficiency point of view, and frankly from a sort of an overall public disruption point of view, pipelines are the best long-term option, and we will get there.
Yes, sir. Make sure I see your hands if you have questions.
My name is Joe Dukert. I'm an independent energy analyst, and this is another why not question. I know how expensive it is to build a refinery. I know how difficult it is to overcome possible environmental objection. But from a strategic point of view, why hasn't Canada developed more refining capacity in the vicinity of its rich hydrocarbon deposits, so that when it exports, whatever the destination, it could retain the value added by refining?
Well, that is being discussed in the Canadian context right now in terms of the westward movement of crude. And on the East Coast, there's several fairly large refining complexes, at least large in our world, 300,000 barrels a day, for example, in New Brunswick, and others around the east, including some in Montreal. So many of the eastern-oriented projects are very much considering how to buttress their crude supply from a Canadian perspective, and I think you will see more of that. At the same time, though, as Andy indicated, the integration of markets and the fluidity in which the North American context has delivered value across the value chain has led to some smart choices about big refining hubs like Chicago, Houston, etc., and pipeline interconnects from Canada have always exercised a good solid connection, with the smaller piece having been the Houston connection, which obviously is what both Seaway and Keystone are all about. Will we retain that value, or will we give that value to our American friends depends on how those connections are done. The only other thing I would comment, and I'm not an oil markets expert per se, but I know that sometimes it is, you have more trading partner choices if you're dealing with a base commodity as opposed to a finely tuned, refined commodity. So that there are, there are some options there. Bad analogy might be, you can sell apples or you can sell, high grade apple sauce, and there's more people who want to buy apples and do different things with them than the guys who are just looking for that select refined product. So.
I think we have a question over here.
Thank you. I'm Bob Scarpel from North Dakota, and I'm a little curious about the fact that in years past, pipelines were the only way to transport oil out of North Dakota. However, with the change in ownership at Burlington Northern Santa Fe, there was a commitment made by that company to transport 1 million barrels a day of oil out by rail out of North Dakota. And we're probably approaching that capability, and I'm wondering what that does to the economics for pipelines, because when there is the alternative of 1 million barrels a day by rail, will a pipeline company give adequate consideration to the competition? Because that rail does provide the opportunity to deliver that oil pretty much anywhere in the nation versus the established routes of pipeline.
Yeah, well, and you'll still have the market cost differential, obviously, in that shipping cost. So even though it's an option, you're still stuck with 3 times the cost of moving things. So it doesn't mean that you won't see a lot of value in the option of an energy highway per se to a particular set of interconnects. Certainly, as you say correctly, I agree. Rail gives you the option of moving those cars to different places, but as Andy said before, even if it exists today, it's still going to cost you close to 3 times as much. But Andy, do you want?
I'll apologize for dragging the audience as I did through a discussion of FERC policies, but it matters. Long-term contracts, that's the key that in some cases is missing in the Bakken. Then you need a shipper ready to sign a long-term contract for the light sweet from the Bakken. And right now, those people that are moving it are refiners that right now are not ready to sign those long-term contracts. When they are, that pipeline gets built, that becomes a much cheaper option. And rail becomes the transition rather than the complement.
Just one follow-up, if I might. As far as the price differential, very honestly, that has been covered by the premiums that are willing to be paid for that Bakken crude. So the differential between cost of pipelining and cost of rail are pretty much non-existent for the most part.
Well, the differential makes it economic to achieve, but it's still a lost piece of the economic pie, if you will. It's why would you spend 3 times as much as you needed to for transport, even though the numbers make it worth moving now as opposed to not moving?
I have a question right here.
Thank you. Myron Ebel, Competitive Enterprise Institute. Ms. Kenny, I was very impressed by your description of your safety campaign and the publicity you're giving it. But it seems to me you have, at least here, left out one piece, and I think this is true of the oil industry in general, and that is that what is being produced and transported is a very good thing. Oil provides, it allows us to have a modern economy, and it keeps us going. And I think your industry could contribute and help the oil industry understand that as long as the public, more and more people think that oil is somehow a toxic commodity, it doesn't matter whether you're shipping it safely or producing it safely. And we really need to concentrate on the benefits of access to affordable energy.
I think that's a very sound remark. And I think that we need to do both that vigorously and also acknowledge to the parties who are expecting a change in our carbon emission portfolio that we do thoroughly understand that within the industry. And when you're making a commitment to something like the Keystone Pipeline, it is not a commitment to a hard track for a 200-year commitment to continued use of fossil fuels necessarily the same way we are today in our economy, as opposed to where is the value contributing, what do we need to sustain, and how do we transition. The fact that infrastructure has a 30-year depreciation allows us the room to say clearly for at least the next 30 years this is fundamental, and probably a lot longer. What I find difficult is in a lot of conversations with key stakeholders, folks end up polarized as to if you believe oil is good, you must not believe in climate change, or the other way around, if you believe in climate change, you must automatically hate oil. I think we need to find a space in the public sphere and in industry to hold those two things together as a dichotomy of moving forward, where there's a lot of good attributes to liquid fuels and methane. And there's also, the capital flows that enable us to transition if and when that is deemed by the public to be something they want to do, in that they want to pay more for their energy because they believe the carbon price should be internalized. One final observation I would make is in the Canadian pipeline world, these companies are big infrastructure, long-term patient capital companies. And Enbridge, for example, has over $3 billion invested in renewables. TransCanada runs one of the largest nuclear sites in the country and is actively involved with wind and solar as well. So energy infrastructure, going back to Chairman Hecker's remarks, is a part of meeting public interest through a transition that exercises the best of the best. And I think we do need to find better ways of communicating that. So I take your point, and would just extend that context.
Could I just add, I think you're going to find, and I think it's already apparent, that the global warming fad has peaked and is on its way down. So I
Well-
wouldn't plan too far ahead for that future.
And I respectfully would disagree with your perspective on that, but nonetheless, I think what I think we would agree on is that it is an important element that science and public opinion will continue to adjust, and what we have done for many decades and generations and will continue to do is be adaptable in meeting public interest needs by deploying private capital effectively.
Aaron, I'll go back to your original point. I think it is important that the pipeline industry connects this to the daily lives of Americans. I have a daughter and a son, and they say, "Dad, pipelines are boring, except for 811, the call before you dig number." But they get tired of me at the gas station. When you're there and that tanker truck is serving the kids, I say, "Kids, where did that gasoline come from, Dad?" "Pipeline." Okay. So they need to understand that it doesn't come from, just the truck. The truck didn't just make up the project. That's at the very end of a long value chain. And sometimes, especially here in the D.C., Northern Virginia area, that gasoline's taking a 1,000-mile trip from Texas, Louisiana through a pipeline. And we're underground, we're out of sight with a high reliability factor so that Americans can forget about it. But we're indispensable, as you see, whenever the power is out and the pipeline can't pump.
I bet their show and tell is really interesting. We have one last question over here.
Hi, my name's Jen Rivers from the Institute for Sustainable Infrastructure. I think my question ties into Myron somewhat. Is the oil and gas pipeline industry using third-party review systems to increase the public confidence in the infrastructure investments? And I'm thinking of a rating system perhaps like the Envision Sustainable Infrastructure Rating System. How are you making it easy to compare projects, not just one pipeline to another, but perhaps pipelines to rail or oil and gas to other types of energy infrastructure? And how are you recognizing projects that incorporate things like community environment, long-term cost beyond the regulatory requirements?
Well, I'll speak to the Canadian experience, starting with the last part first, and the question of the degree to which community environmental interest and exceeding the regulatory requirements is very much a part of these major public hearings. So in Canada, our public hearings for oil and gas transmission pipelines are done in a sort of one project, one review, in which the EA is a critical component, as well as Aboriginal consultation, et cetera. I would say without exception, those companies are going out into the communities well in advance of their regulatory filings, because it's the right thing to do. And it's also a smart thing to do. You want to understand what people are seeing as the risks and how you're going to be responding to those. So one example would be the Enbridge pipeline proposal going to the West Coast has committed to investing about $500 million extra in above compliant safety measures. I know that TransCanada has done similar commitments in the United States on Keystone, and the interface of how best to achieve those, roll them out, make them transparent, be able to evaluate is what we're trying to do through the SEPA Integrity First program and aboutpipelines.com. We're not there yet as far as that transparency. That's very much our objective. But frankly, this issue of which is safer, rail or pipe, people never asked us that question before, firstly. And secondly, it's important that we enter the dialogue, as Annie was saying, because I think that the rail has a fantastic safety record. I applaud those guys moving that scale of heavy equipment over land, above grade, at level crossings and the like, across hundreds of thousands of rail miles. That's phenomenal. They do their work really well. So do we. Our risks and interests and community issues are different. So we need to be able to come at that and have an informed approach to it.
The third-party work that I'm most familiar with is on safety. These operators compete vigorously for commerce, but they collaborate heavily on safety. And so these operators will send to a private third party more information even than the government asks about pipeline accidents. And they're constantly measuring themselves against each other and trying to improve the safety record. And the results in the U.S., similar to Canada, I know, 59% drop in the number of pipeline accidents over the last decade. So that type of third party collaboration, benchmarking, and pushing yourself is working.
I think David has given us the hook, so please join me in thanking this excellent panel.
We'll take a very quick 5-10 minute break so we can switch the